The first drops of blood stained the washboard as Zara Zimmerman scrubbed another shirt with raw hands, her fingertips split open from hours of laundering in the bitter cold water of Redemption Creek. The year was 1873, and Colorado Territory was unforgiving to a woman alone. 18 hours she'd been at it, washing the clothes of miners, cowboys, and townspeople who paid her pennies for the service. It was barely enough to keep a roof over her head, but it was honest work, the only kind available to a 22-year-old widow. "You'll work yourself to death before winter's through," came a deep voice from behind her. Zara didn't bother looking up. "Then I'll die clean, Mr. Quinn." Zachary Quinn dismounted his stallion with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle. At 26, he was already foreman of the Double Bar Ranch, his sun-weathered face and calloused hands telling the story of a life lived outdoors. "Miss Zimmerman, you're bleeding all over Hargrove's Sunday shirt." Only then did Zara notice the crimson droplets spreading across the white cotton. "Damnation," she whispered, plunging her hands into the water. The cold made her wince, but it washed away the blood for the moment. Zach moved closer, his spurs jingling with each step. "Let me see your hands." "I have work to finish," she protested, but he was already kneeling beside her, taking her small hands in his much larger ones. "Good Lord, woman." His voice was hushed with concern as he examined the cracked skin, the deep fissures across her palms, the raw patches where blisters had formed and broken. "How long have they been like this?" "It's nothing. The winter air makes them dry." Zara tried to pull away, but his grip was firm. "This isn't dry, Miss Zimmerman. This is what happens when someone works 18 hours a day with lye soap and freezing water." Without waiting for permission, Zach reached into his saddlebag and retrieved a small tin. "My ma's recipe, beeswax and tallow." Before she could protest, he dipped his fingers into the balm and began to spread it gently across her wounded hands. His touch was surprisingly tender for a man who wrestled steers and broke wild horses. "Mr. Quinn, people will talk," Zara said, though she made no further attempt to withdraw her hands. "Let them," he replied simply. "I won't stand by and watch you bleed for the sake of Hargrove's collar staying white." The warmth of his hands around her sent an unfamiliar sensation up Zara's arms, a feeling she hadn't experienced since before her husband died in a mining accident 15 months prior. She looked up, really seeing Zachary Quinn for the first time, the intensity of his green eyes, the way his dark hair curled beneath his hat, the firm set of his jaw covered in a day's worth of stubble. "There," he said, finally releasing her hands. "That should help, but you need rest, Miss Zimmerman. These need time to heal." "Rest doesn't pay for room and board at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house," Zara replied, though her voice had lost its edge. Zach stood, towering over her kneeling form. "The Double Bar's looking for someone to cook and clean for the ranch hands. 3 meals a day, laundry once a week. You'd have your own cabin, and the pay's better than what you're making here." Zara looked at her half-finished washing, then at her hands, now glistening with the healing balm. "Why would you offer that to me?" "Because I've eaten my own cooking for 3 years and I'm liable to poison someone soon," he said with a crooked smile. "And because no one should work until they bleed." She hesitated, weighing her pride against practicality. "When would you need me to start?" "I can come for you tomorrow morning. Bring whatever you own. It won't be a temporary position unless you want it to be." As he mounted his horse, Zara called out, "Mr. Quinn." He looked down at her, silhouetted against the setting sun. "Thank you," she said simply, raising her bandaged hands slightly. His eyes softened. "Tomorrow, Miss Zimmerman." With a tip of his hat, he turned his horse and rode out of town. Zara watched him go, her hands still tingling from his touch, wondering if she just made the wisest or the most foolish decision of her life. The following morning dawned crisp and clear, with frost glittering on every surface in Redemption Creek. Zara had risen before the sun, packing her meager belongings into a single trunk. 2 dresses, her husband's Bible, a photograph of her parents, and the wedding ring she no longer wore but couldn't bear to sell. Everything she had to show for 22 years of life. Mrs. Holloway sniffed disapprovingly as Zara settled her account. "Going to work at a ranch full of men. Your poor mother would turn in her grave." "My mother would understand survival," Zara replied evenly, and Mr. Quinn assured me I'd have my own quarters. Zachary Quinn may be the most respected foreman in the territory, but he's still a man, Mrs. Holloway warned. And you're still a pretty young widow. Before Zara could respond, the sound of wagon wheels on the hard-packed dirt outside announced Zach's arrival. She gathered her shawl around her shoulders and lifted her chin. "Goodbye, Mrs. Holloway. Thank you for your concern." Outside, Zach was helping the livery boy load her trunk into the back of a wagon. He looked different today, his face freshly shaved, his clothes clean and pressed. He'd even traded his usual work hat for a newer one. "Morning, Miss Zimmerman," he said, offering his hand to help her onto the wagon seat. "Ready for your new life?" The sincerity in his voice made her stomach flutter. "As ready as I'll ever be." The Double Bar Ranch sprawled across 5,000 acres of prime Colorado grazing land, nestled against the foothills of the mountains. As they approached after a 2-hour journey, Zara couldn't help but be impressed by the size of the main house, the well-maintained bunkhouse, and the various outbuildings that made up the ranch headquarters. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. "Been here since '59, Zach explained. "Mr. Barton came out from Boston with nothing but ambition and built all this. His son runs it now, but he's back east most of the time. Leaves the day-to-day to me." He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of a small cabin set apart from the other buildings. "This is yours. Used to be the old foreman's place before they built me a bigger one. It's not fancy, but it's solid and has a good stove." The cabin was indeed small, just one room with a bed, table, 2 chairs, and a cooking stove. But it was clean, with curtains at the windows and a colorful quilt on the bed. Zara stepped inside, inhaling the scent of fresh pine and soap. "Mr. Barton's wife fixed it up before she passed," Zach explained, carrying in her trunk. "Said every ranch should have a woman's touch somewhere." "It's perfect," Zara said, running her fingers along the smooth wooden table. "When do I start my duties?" "Tomorrow's soon enough. Today you rest those hands." He nodded toward her still bandaged fingers. "Cookie's handling meals today. Tomorrow I'll introduce you to the men at breakfast, show you the cookhouse, and explain how things run around here." When he'd gone, Zara sat on the edge of the bed, looking around at her new home. For the first time since becoming a widow, she felt something like hope stirring in her chest. The work would be hard, but no harder than what she'd been doing in town, and here, at least, she'd have her own space and the dignity of a fair wage. She unwrapped the bandages from her hands, examining the raw skin. Already, Zach's mother's balm had begun to help, the angry red cracks beginning to close. She reapplied the ointment from the tin he'd left her, wondering about the kind of man who would notice a laundress's bleeding hands and care enough to do something about it. When dawn broke the next day, Zara was already awake, her hair neatly pinned, wearing her best and only good dress. Her hands were still sore but functional, and she'd wrapped only the worst cracks with thin strips of clean cloth. She made her way to the cookhouse, where Zach was waiting to introduce her to the ranch hands. The cookhouse was larger than she expected, with a massive wood-burning stove, long tables, and benches that could seat at least 20 men. Currently, about 15 cowboys were gathered, all looking at her with undisguised curiosity. "Boys," Zach called out, his voice commanding immediate attention, "this is Miss Zara Zimmerman. She'll be handling the cooking and keeping this place in order from now on. Any man who gives her trouble answers to me." A chorus of "Yes, sir," and "Welcome, madam" filled the room, though Zara didn't miss the speculative glances exchanged between some of the younger men. "Miss Zimmerman's a widow and a respectable woman," Zach continued, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You'll treat her with the same respect you'd show your own mothers or sisters." One older cowboy with a gray streaked beard stepped forward, extending a weathered hand. "Tom Guthrie, madam. Been cook around here for 15 years, but these old bones are grateful to hand over the duties. I'll show you where everything's kept before I move back to the bunkhouse." "Thank you, Mr. Guthrie," Zara said, shaking his hand. "I appreciate any guidance you can offer." For the next hour, Tom showed her around the cookhouse, explaining the routines where supplies were stored and what the men typically expected for meals. "They're not fancy eaters," he assured her. Keep 'em full and make sure there's coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe, and they'll worship the ground you walk on." By noon, Zara had served her first meal, a hearty beef stew she found already simmering, biscuits she'd made fresh, and apple pie that Tom had prepared the day before. The men were appreciative, cleaning their plates and offering compliments that made her cheeks warm with pleasure. Zach was the last to finish, lingering at the table after the others had returned to work. "You've made quite an impression," he observed. "Guthrie says you have a natural touch with the sourdough." "My mother taught me to cook when I was still in braids," Zara replied, gathering his empty plate, "though I've never cooked for so many hungry men before. You'll get used to it. Ranch life has its rhythms." He stood, towering over her small frame. "How are your hands today?" Zara instinctively tucked them against her apron. "Better, thank you. Your mother's remedy is working wonders. She'd be pleased to know it's helping." A shadow crossed his face. "She passed 5 years ago, but I still carry her balm. Comes in handy in ranch work." "I'm sorry for your loss," Zara said softly. "I know how it feels to lose someone you love." Their eyes met, a moment of shared understanding passing between them. Then Zach cleared his throat and reached for his hat. "I'll be back for supper. There's a herd of strays reported up in the north pasture we need to round up." As winter deepened, Zara settled into life at the double bar. Her hands healed completely, forming new calluses from kneading bread and chopping vegetables rather than scrubbing laundry. The ranch hands treated her with respect, though she noticed more than a few of them made excuses to linger in the cookhouse when she was working. Zach was a constant presence, taking his meals with the men but often staying behind to talk with her. She learned that he'd been orphaned at 17, his father killed in the war between the states, his mother following a few years later from consumption. He'd worked his way up from stable boy to foreman through sheer determination, and a natural way with horses and men. In turn, she told him about her brief marriage to William Zimmerman, a kind but reckless man who'd brought her west with promises of gold and fortune, only to die in a mine collapse before their first anniversary. She didn't mention the loneliness that had followed, or the struggle to maintain her dignity in a town where a young widow without family was viewed as either an object of pity or an opportunity. As Christmas approached, Zara found herself paying extra attention to her appearance when Zach was expected. She told herself it was merely gratitude for his kindness, for the job that had saved her from poverty, but deep down, she recognized the flutter in her stomach when he entered the room as something more dangerous. One evening, as a blizzard howled outside, Zach came to her cabin door, snow crusting his coat and hat. "I was worried about you out here alone," he explained, stomping his boots on her threshold. "Wanted to make sure your fire was holding." "Come in before you freeze," she said, stepping back to admit him. The small cabin seemed to shrink with his presence. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair curling damply at his temples. "I brought you something." From inside his coat, he produced a small package wrapped in brown paper. An early Christmas gift. Zara unwrapped it carefully to find a pair of soft leather gloves lined with rabbit fur. "They're beautiful," she whispered, running her fingers over the supple material. "I had them made in Denver," he said, watching her face. Told the glover they were for a lady with the smallest, prettiest hands in the territory. Her cheeks warmed at the compliment. "Mr. Quinn, Zach," he corrected gently. "After 3 months, I think you could call me Zach." "Zach," she amended, surprised by the intimacy of his name on her lips. "You've been too kind to me already." He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the clean scent of soap and leather that always surrounded him. "It's not kindness, Zara." The sound of her name in his deep voice made her heart skip. "Then what is it?" Instead of answering, he reached out, his calloused fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. "I think you know," and she did know. She'd seen it in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking, felt it in the way he found excuses to be near her, recognized it because it mirrored the feelings growing in her own heart. "I'm not looking for another husband," she whispered, even as she leaned slightly into his touch. "I'm not asking you to be my wife," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Not yet. I'm asking for a chance to court you properly, to show you that not all men make promises they can't keep." The howling wind outside seemed to fade away as they stood there, suspended in a moment of possibility. Then slowly, Zara nodded. I'd like that. His smile transformed his face, erasing the weathered lines and revealing the young man beneath the responsible foreman. I'll start tomorrow. A proper courtship, with your permission to call on you, maybe take you for a drive on Sunday if the weather clears. And what will the ranch hands say? She asked. Practical even in this moment of joy, Zach laughed. They've been placing bets on when I'd finally speak up for 3 months now. Tom Guthrie's probably about to win a month's wages. The thought made her smile. And Mr. Barton, what will your employer think of you courting the cook? Joshua Barton's known me since I was a boy mucking his stables. He told me when he hired you that I'd be a fool not to notice what was right in front of me. Zach's hand moved from her face to gently take her hand, his thumb caressing the now healed skin. These hands were what first made me really see you, Zara. Not just look at you, but see you. He raised her hand to his lips, placing a gentle kiss on her palm. I should go before the storm gets worse, he said, though he made no move to release her hand. You could stay, Zara offered impulsively. Just until the worst passes. It wouldn't be proper, but no, he said firmly, though his eyes remained gentle. If I'm going to court you properly, I'll do it right. No gossip, no whispers that might hurt your reputation. He reluctantly released her hand and reached for his hat. I'll see you at breakfast, and Zara. Wear the gloves. I want to make sure they fit. After he'd gone, Zara stood in the middle of her small cabin, her hand still tingling from his kiss, wondering how a woman who'd resigned herself to a life of solitude had suddenly found herself being courted by the most eligible bachelor in the territory. True to his word, Zach began courting her with old-fashioned formality. He escorted her to church on Sundays, waited patiently while she visited with the townswomen, and drove her home in the ranch's best buggy. He brought her small gifts, a ribbon for her hair, wildflowers in spring, a book of poetry she'd mentioned wanting to read. The ranch hands watched with knowing smiles, but kept their teasing good-natured and directed solely at Zach, never at Zara. Even Mrs. Holloway, when they encountered her in town, had to admit that Zachary Quinn's intentions appeared honorable. As winter gave way to spring, and spring blossomed into summer, Zara found herself falling deeply in love with the quiet, steadfast cowboy who had once washed her bleeding hands. They took long walks along the creek that bordered the ranch property, talking about everything and nothing, their childhoods, their dreams, the books they'd read, the places they'd like to see. One evening in late June, as fireflies began to dot the twilight, Zach asked her to ride with him to his favorite spot on the ranch. It's a bit of a journey, he warned as he helped her onto his horse, settling her side saddle before mounting behind her. But I think you'll find it worth the trip. With his arms around her, holding the reins on either side of her waist, Zara leaned back against his chest, feeling secure and cherished. They rode for nearly an hour, climbing steadily into the foothills until they reached a small plateau overlooking the entire valley. Below them, the ranch buildings looked like a child's toys, the grazing cattle mere dots on the landscape. Above, the first stars were appearing in a sky so vast it made Zara catch her breath. This is where I come when I need to remember what's important, Zach said, his breath warm against her ear. When the work seems endless or the responsibility too heavy. He helped her dismount, spreading his coat on a flat rock for her to sit upon. From his saddlebag, he produced a small bundle of bread, cheese, and a bottle of wine. A picnic under the stars, he explained with a smile that made her heart race. As they ate and talked, watching darkness settle fully over the land, Zara felt a sense of peace she hadn't known since childhood. When Zach fell silent, she glanced over to find him watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Zara, he began, his voice unusually hesitant, I brought you here for a reason. She set down her wine, suddenly understanding the significance of this private journey. Yes. He took her hands in his touch as gentle as it had been that first day by the creek. When I saw you working until your hands bled, I admired your determination. When I got to know you, I admired your kindness, your intelligence, your strength. And somewhere along the way, admiration turned to love. Tears pricked at Zara's eyes as he continued. I love you, Zara Zimmerman. I love your gentle hands and your fierce heart. I love the way you hum when you think no one's listening and the way you treat every person with dignity, regardless of their station. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. I'm asking you to be my wife, to build a life with me that's as big as this sky and as enduring as these mountains. Inside the box was a ring, a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. It was my mother's, he explained. She made me promise I'd only give it to a woman worthy of it. A woman I'd love until my dying day. Zara looked from the ring to his face, seeing in his eyes everything she'd ever wanted but had been afraid to hope for: devotion, respect, partnership, and above all, love. Yes, she whispered, her voice breaking on the word. Yes, Zachary Quinn, I will marry you. His smile rivaled the stars for brightness as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Then he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her for the first time, a kiss that began tenderly but quickly deepened with months of restrained passion. When they finally parted, breathless and laughing, Zach pressed his forehead to hers. Mrs. Holloway is going to be insufferably pleased with herself when she hears the news. Let her, Zara replied, echoing his own words from their first meeting. I don't care what anyone thinks as long as I have you. They were married on a perfect September day in 1874, with the aspen trees just beginning to turn gold against the evergreen mountains. The ceremony took place at the ranch, with Mr. Barton returning from Boston to give Zara away, and every ranch hand scrubbed clean and dressed in their Sunday best. Zara wore a gown of ivory silk that Mr. Barton's wife had insisted on ordering from Denver, with lace at the collar and cuffs that made her feel like a princess in a fairy tale. As she walked toward Zach, who stood tall and handsome in a new black suit, she marveled at how far she'd come from the desperate widow washing clothes by a freezing creek. The reception lasted well into the night, with music from a fiddle and harmonica, dancing in the ranch yard, and enough food to feed an army. Tom Guthrie, who had indeed won a substantial pot on the timing of Zach's courtship, presented them with a handmade quilt featuring the Double Bar brand. For your new home, he said, his gruff voice suspiciously thick. Though I expect you'll still be cooking for us poor bachelors. Not for a month, Zach interjected, slipping an arm around his new wife's waist. We're going to San Francisco for our honeymoon. The announcement was met with cheers and good-natured complaints about having to eat Tom's cooking again. Zara leaned into her husband's embrace, still marveling at the word husband and the security it represented. That night, in the privacy of the foreman's cabin that would now be their home, Zach took her hands in his, turning them palm up to examine the skin that had once been raw and bleeding. Do you remember what you said to me that first day? He asked, tracing the lines of her palm with his finger. That I'd die clean, Zara recalled with a small laugh. You said it like you expected to die alone, Zach said, his voice serious now. I decided right then that I wouldn't let that happen. You saved me, she whispered, overwhelmed by the journey that had brought them to this moment. But Zach shook his head. No, Zara, you saved yourself with your courage and determination. I just had the good sense to recognize a woman worth loving when I saw her. He raised her hands to his lips, kissing first one palm and then the other. I promise you'll never work until you bleed again, not as long as I have breath in my body. And I promise to never stop appreciating the man who noticed a laundress's hands, Zara replied, drawing him closer. The man who taught me to believe in love again. As his lips met hers, Zara knew with absolute certainty that she had found her home not in a place, but in the arms of a man whose gentle hands had healed more than just her physical wounds. The years that followed brought changes to the Double Bar Ranch. Joshua Barton, impressed with Zach's management and vision, eventually offered him a partnership. By 1880, the ranch had doubled in size, with new breeding stock imported from Europe and a reputation for the finest horses in the territory. Zara continued to oversee the cookhouse, but with hired help now that the operation had expanded. She took particular pride in the ranch garden, which supplied fresh vegetables in summer and preserved goods in winter. The Cowboys still claimed her biscuits were the best in 3 territories. Their family grew as well. First came William, named for Zara's first husband in a gesture of respect for the past. then Elizabeth, who had her father's green eyes and her mother's determination. Finally, Thomas, named for old Tom Guthrie, who had become like a grandfather to the children before passing peacefully in his sleep during the harsh winter of 1883, through it all the prosperity and the hardships. The joys and the sorrows Zach and Zara's love remained the bedrock of their lives. They weathered blizzards that threatened the herds, drought years that tested their resources, and the changing landscape as Colorado achieved statehood and the frontier began to disappear. They watched their children grow strong and capable, each finding their own path. William inherited his father's way with horses and his mother's head for business, eventually taking over more of the ranch operations as Zach grew older. Elizabeth, fiercely independent, attended one of the new women's colleges back east before returning to establish the region's first proper school. And Thomas, the dreamer, spent his days sketching the wilderness and his nights writing stories of the West that would someday find their way into print. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1899, with the new century on the horizon, Zach surprised Zara with a journey back to the plateau where he'd proposed. Despite the silver now threading through his dark hair and the lines that mapped their years together on both their faces, he helped her onto his horse with the same care he'd shown that first night. The view had changed. More settlements dotted the valley, and a distant train whistle echoed against the mountains, but the essentials remained the same. The vast sky, the enduring mountains, and the two of them, still finding wonder in each other's company. Would you do it all again? Zach asked as they shared wine and watched the sunset paint the sky in spectacular colors. If you could go back to that day by the creek, knowing everything that would come, the good and the bad, would you still put your bleeding hands in mine? Zara studied the man beside her, older now, with the weathered dignity of a life well lived, but still the same steadfast, honorable soul who had once knelt beside a laundress and offered kindness when she needed it most. In a heartbeat, she answered truthfully. Every moment, from that first day to this one, has been a gift I never expected to receive. Zach's smile was as warm as it had been a quarter-century before. Even the year we lost half the herd to disease, or when Elizabeth broke her arm falling from that wild Mustang I told her not to ride. Or the summer William ran away to join the army before we tracked him down in Denver, Zara laughed, the sound carrying across the plateau. Even then, because you were beside me through it all, just as you promised you'd be. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, they sat in comfortable silence, their hands intertwined as they had been countless times over the years. Zara thought about the desperate young widow she'd been, working until her hands bled just to survive. She could never have imagined then the rich tapestry her life would become, the love, the family, the sense of purpose and belonging. You're thinking hard, Zach observed, brushing a strand of hair from her face with the same tenderness he'd always shown. I was thinking that sometimes salvation comes in unexpected forms, she replied. For me, it was a cowboy who noticed bleeding hands when no one else did. And for me, Zach said, gathering her close against the evening chill, it was a woman who reminded me what it meant to care for someone more than myself. As they rode home beneath a canopy of stars, Zara leaned back against her husband's chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart. In a world that had changed dramatically since their first meeting, with automobiles beginning to replace horses, electricity illuminating homes, and the Wild West gradually becoming more memory than reality, their love remained constant, a shelter against time's passage and life's uncertainties. The next morning, as dawn broke over the double bar, Zara stood on the porch of the home they'd built together, watching Zach in the corral with their youngest grandchild, 5-year-old Sarah. The little girl sat proudly on a gentle pony, her small hands correctly positioned on the reins as her grandfather walked alongside, offering instruction and encouragement just as he had for their own children years before. Seeing them together, the aging cowboy and the bright-eyed child representing the future, Zara felt her heart swell with a gratitude so profound it brought tears to her eyes. From her bleeding hands at Redemption Creek to this moment of generational connection, her journey had been one of unexpected blessings. As if sensing her gaze, Zach looked up, his weathered face breaking into the smile that still made her pulse quicken after all these years. He whispered something to Sarah, who waved enthusiastically, then made his way toward the porch, his gait slightly slower than in his youth, but still carrying the easy confidence that had first drawn Zara's attention. "Good morning, Mrs. Quinn," he said, climbing the steps to stand beside her. "You're up early." "I wanted to see the sunrise," she replied, leaning into him as his arm circled her waist, "and to count my blessings before the day gets busy." Zach pressed a kiss to her temple. "And how many blessings did you count?" Zara smiled, watching Sarah guide her pony in a small circle, her face alight with accomplishment. "Too many to number. But they all began the day a kind cowboy washed my bleeding hands." In the golden light of morning, with the ranch coming alive around them and the promise of another day together stretching before them, Zachary Quinn took his wife's hands in his, examining the soft skin that bore faint scars, reminders of a harder time long past. "These hands built a life," he said simply. "Our life." "Together," Zara agreed, turning her palms up to meet his, "always together." And in that moment, as in all the moments they'd shared since that fateful day in 1873, they knew with absolute certainty that some loves truly are strong enough to heal all wounds, even those that once made hands bleed from honest labor and hearts ache from unspoken loneliness. For Zach and Zara Quinn, the journey that began with bleeding hands and gentle washing had led to a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone, carried forward in the lives of their children, their grandchildren, and all who heard the story of the laundress and the cowboy who found in each other the courage to begin again. As the new century dawned, bringing with it changes they could scarcely imagine, their love remained a testament to the enduring power of compassion, respect, and the healing touch of hands that reach out to help when they're needed most.